The moment I turned 18, my parents sat me down in our living room and told me something that changed my life forever. They said I would be marrying my 31-year-old cousin Michael right after my high school graduation because our family needed to preserve what they called our exceptional bloodline through careful family planning. My mother came from an old money family in Virginia that still operated like they were living in a different century, believing they carried special genes that made them naturally superior to others. My father was a researcher who had lost his position at several medical institutions for his controversial theories about genetics. But he continued his work in our home office, filling filing cabinets with what he called essential research. Throughout my entire childhood, they had been collecting samples and creating detailed family trees that covered the walls of our study. According to their calculations, Michael and I would produce children with the highest concentration of what they referred to as heritage genetics. Michael was 31 and had been spending time with me since I was 13, always under the pretense of family bonding and mentorship. He would take me on long drives where he would explain how fortunate I was to be selected as his future partner and would describe in detail the family we would build together. At least 5 children, he would say while patting my hand, possibly 7 if everything went according to plan. My parents encouraged these meetings and would deliberately leave us alone in the house for hours, despite my obvious discomfort and attempts to avoid being alone with him. My mother would insist I wear my nicest dresses before he arrived and would remind me to be gracious and charming to the man who would be my husband. They had already reserved the venue at our family's historic estate and had sent save-the-dates to other families within their selective community network. The preparations intensified when I turned 18, and they began what they called preparing me for my future responsibilities. My mother took me to a private physician who conducted extensive examinations and declared that I was in perfect condition for what lay ahead. This doctor operated from a home office and wasn't listed in any medical directories, but my parents trusted him completely because he shared their beliefs about preserving certain family lines. He prescribed special supplements to optimize my health and gave my parents detailed calendars marked with important dates and cycles. Michael began visiting more frequently, and during family dinners, he would openly discuss the characteristics our future children would inherit. "Our firstborn will have the family's distinctive features," he announced one evening while my parents smiled approvingly. "We're going to restore this family's prominence through our union." When I tried to confide in teachers at school, I discovered my parents had already laid the groundwork, telling the administration that I was going through a difficult phase and was prone to creating dramatic stories for attention. They contributed generously to the school's fundraising campaigns, ensuring that no administrator would risk their donations by taking my concerns seriously. When I pleaded with my older brother James for help, he merely shrugged and reminded me that he had married within the family circle 2 years ago, so what was I so upset about? The entire extended family was committed to this tradition and treated me like a valuable asset being prepared for an important transaction. My mother decided to homeschool me during my senior year to limit outside influences and maintain constant supervision over my activities. She would have me study family histories and test me on genealogies stretching back 12 generations. The isolation was overwhelming, and I spent countless hours gazing out my bedroom window, imagining escape routes that seemed impossible to execute. Everything shifted when I discovered my grandmother's hidden journal in the attic, while searching for anything valuable I could sell for escape money. She had meticulously documented decades of arranged marriages within the family and what happened to young women who resisted. 3 of my aunts had attempted to leave and were brought back for what she called adjustment procedures that left them unable to have children. Another cousin who had fallen in love with someone outside the approved family circle had died in what was reported as an unfortunate accident just 2 weeks before her scheduled wedding. The journal contained names, dates, and photographs of young women who had tried to resist the family's plans. My grandmother had apparently helped several escape, but was discovered and subjected to intensive psychiatric treatment until she could no longer remember their names or where they had gone. The final entry was a warning to any young woman who might find her words. "They will go to any length to prevent you from disrupting the family line." Each page revealed another disturbing truth about my family's marriage traditions and the extremes they would pursue to maintain their vision of genetic purity. Using a code hidden in the journal, I managed to contact one of the escaped cousins who had been living under an assumed name for 12 years. She told me about a network of people who helped young women escape from families like ours. She had been living freely for over a decade, but said the freedom was worth the constant vigilance required to stay hidden. We arranged for her to pick me up during Michael's next visit, when my parents would be occupied with wedding preparations. The plan was straightforward but required precise timing, and I spent days memorizing every detail and practicing what I would do. But somehow they discovered the journal and learned about my escape plan. When Michael arrived that day, he wasn't alone. He had brought 2 other male cousins and a collection of medical supplies that made my blood run cold. My mother locked all the doors, while my father explained they had decided to move the wedding to that very evening because I had proven myself too unreliable to wait any longer. "We'll have the ceremony first," my father said, pulling leather restraints from a medical bag. "Then Michael will ensure the marriage is binding before you can attempt anything else foolish." They began preparing an IV drip, and Michael smiled at me while filling a syringe. "Don't worry, dear cousin. The sedatives will make you more compliant for what needs to happen." I pressed myself against the wall, but there was nowhere to run with 3 men blocking every possible exit. My mother held my arms while Michael approached with the needle. "Just a small injection," he whispered, "and then you'll belong to me forever." My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening, and I drove my knee into Michael's midsection with every ounce of strength I possessed. He dropped the syringe and collapsed forward, gasping for air while I twisted free from my mother's grasp and grabbed the journal from the coffee table. My father lunged toward me, but I ducked under his arms and ran for the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Behind me, my mother screamed for the other cousins to catch me while Michael groaned on the floor, still struggling to breathe. I reached the upstairs bathroom and slammed the door shut, wedging a chair under the doorknob just as footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door shook violently as they threw their weight against it, and I could hear my father telling someone to get his tools from the garage. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and typed the emergency number with the message we had agreed upon. The bathroom window was already slightly open from my practice runs, and I pushed it wider, hearing metal scraping against metal as my father worked on removing the door hinges. I climbed onto the toilet, then onto the sink counter, and squeezed through the window frame, dropping onto the garage roof below. My ankle twisted painfully when I landed, but I kept moving, sliding down to the garden shed roof, then jumping to the ground. The bathroom door crashed open above me, and Michael's voice rang out, alerting everyone that I was in the backyard. I ran toward the wooded area behind our property, knowing every path and hiding spot from years of solitary exploration. The woods were dark, but I knew the creek path by memory and followed it deeper into the trees. Behind me, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and I could hear the men spreading out, attempting to surround me. My phone buzzed with a reply saying she would be at the old stone bridge in 5 minutes. My injured ankle throbbed with each step, but I pushed through the pain, knowing this was my only opportunity for escape. The bridge came into view, but no vehicle was waiting, and panic flooded through me. Branches cracked nearby, and then headlights appeared, but it was my father's SUV, not the sedan I was expecting. I pressed myself behind the concrete bridge support, holding my breath as he drove slowly past, sweeping a spotlight across the trees. His radio crackled with Michael coordinating the search pattern and instructing someone to check the gas station down the road. After the SUV passed, I remained frozen for another minute before more headlights appeared from the opposite direction. The grey sedan pulled up, and I sprinted from my hiding spot, yanking the back door open and diving inside. She accelerated before I even got the door closed, and we passed my father's SUV heading back toward the bridge. I laid flat across the back seat, not daring to breathe as our vehicles passed within inches of each other. She kept driving steady and calm while I stayed down for another 15 minutes until she said it was safe to sit up. 3 hours later, we pulled into a rest stop and I locked myself in a bathroom stall, finally able to examine my grandmother's journal again. The pages about the safe houses were water damaged, but I could make out addresses in 4 different states. She knocked gently, saying we needed to keep moving, and I realized I had left my phone in her car. My ankle had swollen inside my shoe, and each step sent sharp pain up my leg. But I followed her back to the sedan. She drove through the night, explaining the network's protocols while I watched the familiar mountains fade behind us. No contact with anyone from our past for 8 months minimum while they built a legal case. New identity documents would be waiting at the safe house along with an attorney who specialized in these situations. They had helped dozens of young women escape from families like mine and knew how to keep us hidden. I watched the landscape I had known all my life disappear, understanding I could never return even if I wanted to. The next morning, we stopped at a small cafe 4 states away, and I tried to force down toast and eggs while she made phone calls. The television above the counter played local news, but there was no mention of a missing person. I wondered if my family had even contacted the authorities, or if they were handling this internally as my grandmother's journal had described. Her phone rang constantly, and she stepped outside to take calls from network contacts. When she returned, her expression was tense, and she explained they were implementing emergency protocols. My family had connections in law enforcement across multiple states, and the network had intercepted communications about potential roadblocks being established. We needed to switch vehicles immediately and take an alternate route to the safe house. 3 other young women had escaped similar situations just this year, and the network was stretched thin, protecting everyone. She paid the check, and we walked to the parking lot where a blue minivan was waiting with the keys under the floor mat. The woman who had left it was long gone, but she said she was another survivor who had been free for 7 years now. We transferred my bag and the journal to the new vehicle and left the sedan for someone else to retrieve later. As we drove away, I thought about those other young women running from their own versions of Michael and forced marriage arrangements. The network existed because this happened more frequently than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Families with wealth and twisted beliefs forcing their daughters into arranged marriages to preserve what they considered pure bloodlines. She said some of the young women came from religious communities, while others escaped from wealthy families like mine. All of us running from people who saw us as property rather than human beings with our own dreams and choices. She pulled into a rest stop about 2 hours later, and my stomach dropped when I saw the state police car parked near the entrance. The officer was standing by his cruiser, studying something on his phone, and then looking up at each vehicle that passed. She saw him too, and her entire body tensed, but she kept driving slowly toward the parking area as if nothing was wrong. She pulled into a space far from the officer and grabbed her phone, typing rapidly while keeping her head down. "Restroom," she said quietly, and we got out, walking casually even though my legs felt like they might give out. The officer started moving in our direction, and I wanted to run, but she grabbed my arm, keeping me steady. We went into the women's restroom, and she led me past the stalls to a door marked "Employees Only" that she pushed open without hesitation. Another woman was waiting there with keys to a different vehicle, and she pushed me toward her while glancing back at the main door. We hurried across the back lot to the waiting van where the woman who introduced herself as Margaret was already starting the engine. Margaret drove with practiced calm while my rescuer watched behind us, and after 10 minutes, she finally relaxed her shoulders. Margaret told me she had escaped from her own family 22 years ago when they tried to force her to marry her mother's brother. She had been just 16 at the time, younger than I was now, and the experience had motivated her to dedicate her life to helping others escape similar situations. She explained how my parents had already filed a missing person report, claiming I had been taken by a dangerous group that targeted vulnerable young women from good families. The news reports were portraying me as a victim of manipulation, and my parents were on every channel, tearfully pleading for my safe return. This was how these families always handled it, making the escapees appear unstable or brainwashed so nobody would believe our stories if we tried to speak out. 4 days later, I was sitting in a small apartment, trying to remember that my new name was Rebecca Anderson. The network's attorney, A woman who preferred to be called simply counsel handed me a legal pad and asked me to write down everything I could remember. She said the details about the forced marriage plans needed to be documented while they were still fresh in my memory. My hand cramped after filling 30 pages, but I kept writing about Michael and the supplements and the medical examinations. The attorney returned with her laptop and showed me the news coverage about my disappearance. My parents looked perfect on camera, with my mother dabbing at her eyes and my father's voice breaking as he begged for my return. They had even set up a tip line and were offering a substantial reward for information leading to my safe return. The comments sections were filled with sympathy for them, calling me selfish and ungrateful for running away from such devoted parents. One commenter suggested I was probably involved with drugs, and another said young people today don't appreciate good families and traditional values. Nobody questioned why an 18-year-old from such a seemingly loving family would run away just weeks before graduation. The attorney said this was standard procedure for families like mine who knew how to control public perception and had the resources to shape the narrative. Then the burner phone rang, and it was my brother James saying our mother had been hospitalized due to the stress of my disappearance. He begged me to at least call and let them know I was alive because the doctors were concerned about her condition. My hand was reaching for the phone when Margaret grabbed it and listened to James continue talking. His tone changed when he realized I wasn't responding, and he said they had resources to find me with or without cooperation from authorities. Margaret ended the call, and within an hour, we were packing because even burner phones could be traced with the right technology. Margaret drove us to another safe house, and during the drive she shared her story in measured sentences. Her family had forced her to have a child at 15 with her mother's brother to maintain what they called their family's special bloodline. She escaped after giving birth, but had to leave her daughter behind, who was now 37 and continuing the family traditions. The network had hundreds of these stories documented over the years. Young women who managed to escape and others who didn't survive the attempt. A week after my escape, I was in my 5th safe house, unable to sleep because every sound made me fear they had found me. I kept checking the locks and reading passages from my grandmother's journal to remind myself why I had run. One entry described a young woman named Elizabeth who was found after 3 years of hiding and brought back for a ceremony in the family's basement. The family kept her sedated for the wedding, and 10 months later, she had twins before disappearing completely. My grandmother suspected she hadn't survived the birth, but there was no way to confirm what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth and whether she was buried somewhere on the family property or locked away in some forgotten room, forced to produce child after child for the family line. The network doctor came to examine me because I had mentioned the vitamin injections I had been receiving. During her examination, she found a small scar behind my knee that I didn't remember getting. She said it looked like a surgical incision, but I had no memory of any procedures in that area. An X-ray revealed something metallic under the skin, about the size of a grain of rice. The doctor's face went pale when she realized it was a tracking device that must have been implanted during one of my medical examinations while I was sedated. She had to remove it immediately, but when she made the incision, she discovered 2 devices nested together. The first one had been transmitting my location continuously since it was implanted, but the second one was dormant until the first was removed. It activated with an audible beep and began broadcasting a much stronger signal. The doctor said we had perhaps 20 minutes before someone triangulated the signal and arrived at our location. The entire network went into crisis mode, with people making rapid phone calls and destroying documents. Margaret drove at dangerous speeds toward another safe house while I clutched my grandmother's journal and tried not to panic. At an intersection, I saw my father's SUV and my entire body went rigid with fear. Michael was in the passenger seat and 2 cousins were in the back, all of them scanning vehicles at the traffic light. Margaret yanked the wheel hard, turning into a parking structure, and the tires squealed as we ascended the ramp too quickly. She pulled into a space and we ran for the stairwell, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. We burst out of the stairwell at street level and Margaret grabbed my arm to slow me down so we wouldn't attract attention. The bus terminal was only 4 blocks away, but every person we passed made my heart race faster. Margaret kept checking behind us while I pulled my hood up and tried to look like a normal college student, even though my hands were trembling uncontrollably. At the corner, she stopped at a payphone and made a brief call while I watched for any sign of my father's vehicle. She hung up, and we walked quickly toward the bus station sign ahead. The station was crowded with travellers, and I stayed close to Margaret as she purchased my ticket with cash. She handed me a driver's license with my photograph, but a different name and birth date that made me 22 years old. The departure board showed my bus leaving in 12 minutes from gate 15. Margaret walked me to the gate, then stopped and looked at me intently. "Remember everything I taught you about the verification codes," she said quietly. "Trust no one until you confirm them through the network's secure channel." She squeezed my shoulder once, then walked away quickly toward the parking lot. I got in line behind an elderly couple with matching luggage and watched Margaret through the window as she got into yet another vehicle. The bus driver took my ticket without really examining it, and I found a seat in the back where I could observe everyone who boarded. Margaret's car pulled out heading east while my bus would travel south, and I pressed my forehead against the cold window watching her disappear into traffic. More passengers boarded, and I pulled my hood lower, studying each face for anyone who might be connected to my family. The bus finally departed, and I gripped my grandmother's journal in my backpack, feeling its weight against my side as a reminder of why I was running. 2 weeks into my escape, I was alone for the first time since that terrifying night in my parents' living room. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and I opened the journal to a page I had marked earlier. Elizabeth's story was written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, and it made my stomach churn with each detail. She had escaped in 1985 and managed to stay hidden for 6 months before her brothers located her working at a restaurant in Colorado. They dragged her back, and my grandmother heard sounds from the basement for weeks afterward. Elizabeth was never seen again, but my grandmother found blood-stained linens in the incinerator. The entry ended with my grandmother's note that Elizabeth had been pregnant by someone outside the family when they captured her, which sealed her fate. I closed the journal and watched the landscape change outside the window, telling myself I wouldn't end up like Elizabeth or the others who hadn't made it to freedom. At the transfer station in Kentucky, I had 5 hours to wait for my connecting bus. The station was smaller than I expected, with flickering fluorescent lights and uncomfortable plastic chairs. I found a corner seat where I could monitor both entrances while pretending to read a magazine. 2 hours into my wait, I spotted my cousin David interviewing drivers near the ticket counter, showing them something that was probably my photograph. He was taking notes on their responses and seemed to be working his way systematically through everyone in the terminal. I walked casually to the restroom and locked myself in a stall. Pulling out the new burner phone Margaret had given me, the network contact answered immediately, and I whispered my situation. They instructed me to purchase a ticket for the opposite direction, ride it for 3 stops, then double back tomorrow using a different route. This would throw off anyone tracking my movements and buy time for them to arrange safer transportation. I waited 25 minutes, timing it so David would be occupied with the incoming passengers from another bus. I emerged from the restroom as if nothing was wrong and walked to a different ticket window while David was facing away from the departure area. I bought a ticket to Nashville and boarded just as David turned toward my original gate. Through the window, I watched him checking passengers on the other bus while mine pulled away from the terminal. My hands finally stopped shaking as we left the city limits behind. 3 days later, I finally arrived at the new safe house, a modest brick home with an American flag in the front yard and a well-maintained garden. The elderly couple who answered the door looked like anyone's grandparents, with warm smiles and matching cardigans. They welcomed me inside, and the woman made chamomile tea, while the man explained that they had both escaped from similar family situations 45 years ago. Over homemade soup and fresh bread, they told me my family was part of a network spanning 15 states with thousands of members who believed in maintaining genetic purity through arranged marriages within the bloodline. The woman showed me scars on her wrists from when her family tried to force her into marriage with her uncle when she was just 16. They had dedicated their retirement years to helping young women escape these situations and had successfully helped 19 so far. The next morning, they drove me to the courthouse to file for an emergency protective order. The judge initially seemed sympathetic, nodding as I explained about the forced marriage plans and the medical procedures. But when I mentioned specific family names, his expression shifted dramatically. He shuffled papers and declared there wasn't sufficient evidence of immediate danger to grant the order. As he denied my request, I noticed his nameplate clearly for the first time. Morrison was one of the allied families my grandmother had listed in her journal as being part of the network. He knew exactly who I was and what I was running from, but he was protecting the system that had protected his own family for generations. Back at the safe house, I couldn't sleep, feeling trapped even with these kind people trying to protect me. At 4 in the morning, I woke up thirsty and headed to the kitchen for water. I heard voices from the living room and pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man speaking on the phone. "Yes, we have Rebecca," he said softly. "The real one. Not another runaway using that identity. We'll bring her in carefully tomorrow after she trusts us completely." My blood turned to ice as I realized these weren't genuine network members but bounty hunters hired by families to retrieve runaways. I crept back to my room silently and grabbed my grandmother's journal and the small amount of cash I had left. I opened the window and climbed out in my pajamas and socks, my bare feet hitting the cold grass. Behind me, I heard the back door open and saw flashlight beams sweeping across the yard. I ran harder, my feet slapping against the pavement as porch lights activated and dogs began barking throughout the neighborhood. I turned random corners, trying to lose them, and spotted an unlocked car in someone's driveway. I yanked the door open and dove into the back seat, pulling a forgotten jacket over myself. Through the window, I watched the elderly couple and 3 men spread out with flashlights, checking yards and peering into parked cars. They searched for nearly 3 hours while I lay frozen under the jacket, barely allowing myself to breathe. When they finally gave up and drove away, I remained hidden until dawn began breaking over the horizon. My feet were bleeding from running on the rough pavement, and I had no shoes, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I snuck out of the car and walked until I found a public library just opening for the day. The librarian barely glanced at me as I headed straight for the computers in the back corner of the building. I accessed the network's emergency website and entered the verification codes Margaret had made me memorize. The screen loaded slowly and I searched for the elderly couple's names in the database. There they were on the compromised list, with photographs and detailed information about their deception tactics. They had been catching runaways for 18 years, paid handsomely by families to act like helpful grandparents while gathering information and gaining trust. I had been off the legitimate network's grid for 4 days, and they probably assumed I had been captured and returned. I sat in a quiet study room later, reading more of my grandmother's journal about the fake network that had operated for decades alongside the real one. Some young women were returned to their families for forced marriages, while others simply vanished without a trace. The families funded both the genuine escape network and the fake ones, playing both sides to ensure they could recover their runaway daughters. There was no reliable way to determine who was genuinely trying to help and who was hunting for bounties. I stared at the phone on the desk, remembering the only number I had memorized from before my escape. Ms. Sarah Chen had been my guidance counselor during my junior year, and she had seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, despite my family's generous donations to the school. She had pulled me aside once after noticing bruises on my arms and asked if everything was all right at home, but I had been too terrified to tell her the truth. I picked up the phone and dialed, my hand shaking as I heard it ring. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice exactly as I remembered it from our counseling sessions. "Oh my God, Rebecca, is that really you?" she said quickly. "The entire school thinks you joined some extremist group. Your parents have been telling everyone you were brainwashed by online predators." I took a deep breath and told her everything that had really happened. The words tumbled out in a rush about the forced marriage, the medical procedures, the escape attempt, and the tracking devices. I could hear her breathing change on the other end as she processed what I was telling her. She stayed quiet for almost 2 minutes before saying she was coming to get me immediately. I tried to tell her it was too dangerous, that my family had resources and connections everywhere, but she had already hung up. and I heard a car engine starting before the line went dead. I spent 3 weeks in that library, hiding in different sections during the day and sleeping in the 24-hour study room at night while she made arrangements to drive the 10 hours from her new teaching position. She arrived at dawn in an older Honda Civic, and I barely recognized her with her hair dyed black and wearing clothes completely different from her usual professional attire. We drove for 3 hours before I noticed the black SUV maintaining exactly the same distance behind us, regardless of our speed or lane changes. Chen noticed too, and her knuckles went white on the steering wheel, but her voice remained steady when she told me she had been documenting concerns about my family since she first noticed signs of abuse. She had photographed my injuries and kept copies of my essays where I had hinted at what was happening at home, building a file she hoped she would never need to use. The SUV moved closer, and I could see Michael's face through the windshield as Ms. Chen took an exit toward the police station without using her turn signal. Michael followed us directly into the parking lot and jumped out of his vehicle before we had even stopped moving. Inside the station, he transformed into the concerned cousin perfectly, telling the desk sergeant that I was mentally unstable and that Miss Chen was a predator who had been grooming me through our school counseling sessions. He produced a thick folder of medical documents signed by multiple doctors, all stating that I suffered from delusional disorder and false memory syndrome stemming from childhood trauma. The documents described elaborate delusions about forced marriages and family conspiracies that supposedly existed only in my troubled mind. Officer Patricia Williams took the documents and began reading through them carefully, while Michael explained how my loving parents just wanted their sick daughter back for proper psychiatric treatment. Williams continued examining the papers, and her expression grew increasingly skeptical when she noticed inconsistencies in the dates and that several signatures looked suspiciously similar despite being from different doctors. She separated us into different rooms for individual questioning, and Michael's carefully maintained mask slipped momentarily when she announced she needed to interview us separately. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold my grandmother's journal as I showed it to Officer Williams page by page. Her face grew increasingly pale as she read the entries about Officer James Mitchell, who had returned my cousin Sarah 4 times before she finally disappeared forever. Williams set the journal down and made a phone call to someone named James, asking pointed questions about certain families and payment records from 6 years ago. I could hear angry shouting through the phone before she ended the call and informed me that her former colleague had just admitted to accepting bribes to return runaway women to their families. She immediately opened an official investigation and told Michael he would not be taking me anywhere while she contacted state authorities about potential human trafficking charges. Michael began screaming about family rights and constitutional freedoms, threatening lawsuits, and claiming we would regret interfering with their community traditions. Williams had 2 officers escort him from the building while she arranged for me to be placed in protective custody immediately. The women's shelter had reinforced windows and a security guard who checked everyone entering the facility, but I still couldn't sleep that first night there. Every footstep in the hallway made me clutch the journal tighter, and I kept reading my grandmother's final entry repeatedly. Trust no one completely and always have another exit. The words felt like she had written them specifically for me as I listened to other women crying through the thin walls. Williams returned the next morning accompanied by a federal agent named Director Monica Thompson, who specialized in cases involving cults and human trafficking. Director Thompson had encountered similar forced marriage networks in other states, but had never seen such detailed documentation as my grandmother's journal provided. She photographed every page and entered them into evidence while explaining how these networks operated across state lines using medical professionals, law enforcement, and even judges to maintain their control over women in their communities. The investigation expanded rapidly as Director Thompson arranged for me to stay with a verified foster family while they built the case against my parents and the broader network. The foster family lived in a typical suburban home with 2 teenage children and a golden retriever, who enthusiastically greeted everyone who entered. Mrs. Ladies. Foster showed me to a normal bedroom with windows that actually opened and door locks that only worked from the inside, giving me control over my own space for the first time. Nobody watched my every movement or made me recite family bloodlines or subjected me to invasive medical examinations. It felt surreal, like I was playing pretend in someone else's life while waiting for reality to crash back down. They enrolled me in a different school under my protective identity, and I sat in calculus class trying to focus on mathematical equations while the girl next to me complained about her parents not letting her attend a concert. She had no idea that according to my family's planning schedule, I was supposed to be pregnant with my cousin's child by now. A boy named Tyler asked if I wanted to go to the winter formal dance with him, and I almost laughed at how normal he assumed my life was, how he couldn't imagine the world I had escaped from. Then James appeared across the street from school one afternoon, just standing there watching me walk toward the bus. My security detail moved to intercept him, but he held up a handwritten sign that said "Mother in ICU, please come home, she's dying." He knew exactly which buttons to push because despite everything they had done, I still felt a pang of concern, wondering if something had actually happened to her. That emotional manipulation was part of their strategy to make me doubt my decision to escape. Director Thompson arrived at the foster home that evening with recordings her team had obtained through investigation warrants on my parents' phones. My father's voice filled the room discussing retrieval strategies for their escaped asset, meaning me, while Michael described something called the compliance protocol for forced insemination if I resisted. My mother could be heard in the background, suggesting they might need to use the basement medical room they had prepared for difficult cases. The FBI raid occurred the following morning at dawn, and they found everything still in place, including the detailed family charts covering the walls and the medical equipment in the basement that my father had assembled. 4 days later, Director Thompson called me at the foster home to share what they had discovered during the raid. The FBI team had found sedatives, restraints, and medical supplies in my parents' basement, along with detailed planning documents for forced marriages involving 14 different young women in their network. They also discovered 4 pregnant teenagers living in the house who claimed they were there voluntarily, but Director Thompson recognized clear signs of psychological manipulation and Stockholm Syndrome in all of them. The case exploded beyond just my situation when investigators realized how many families across multiple states were involved in this systematic forced marriage network. I watched the news coverage from the foster family's living room as my parents stood outside the courthouse claiming religious persecution and violation of their parental rights. My father told reporters they were being targeted for their traditional family values, while my mother wept about government overreach destroying American families. Several state senators actually defended them on television, calling it an attack on religious freedom and time-honored family traditions. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs supporting parental rights and traditional marriage values, which made me realize how deeply embedded and powerful this network truly was throughout society. 8 weeks after my escape, Mrs. Foster began teaching me how to prepare normal meals without the strict nutritional protocols I had grown up with. Every meal in my childhood home had been precisely calculated for optimal genetic health, with exact protein ratios and supplements designed to enhance fertility. We made lasagna together while I explained these disturbing meal planning rules, and she listened without judgment, offering me seconds without calculating calories or asking about my reproductive health like my mother always had. Margaret contacted me through Director Thompson, reporting that she had been building a comprehensive case with 15 other young women who had escaped from network families. They were planning to testify together in federal court, but 3 women had already withdrawn their statements after family pressure, and another had vanished the previous week. The network's legal team was formidable, with unlimited funding from generations of accumulated wealth and connections throughout the justice system at every level. My deposition was scheduled for the following month, when the foster family's home was vandalized, with disturbing messages spray-painted across their garage door and every window on the front of the house shattered. A note left in the mailbox threatened worse consequences if I testified against my family and their sacred traditions. The foster family wanted to continue sheltering me, but I couldn't allow them to be endangered because of my situation. So I requested alternative placement for their safety. Director Thompson moved me to a secure facility designed for witnesses in federal cases, where I met Ashley, who had escaped 7 years ago and had been in protective custody ever since. Ashley showed me scars across her abdomen from what her family called a correction procedure after she refused her arranged marriage at 17. They had attempted to surgically sterilize her to prevent her from contaminating the bloodline by having children with someone outside their approved genetic pool, but she had escaped mid-procedure while still hemorrhaging. 3 months after my escape, I developed chronic insomnia and found myself checking locks obsessively throughout the night at the secure facility. The facility therapist prescribed anxiety medication, but I refused to take any pills, remembering all the vitamins my parents had given me that turned out to be fertility drugs designed to prepare my body for pregnancy. I read my grandmother's journal repeatedly, finding strength in knowing someone else had survived this nightmare and tried to help others escape the same fate. Michael was arrested on charges of attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, and human trafficking, but posted bail within hours, paid by a religious freedom organization with deep pockets. I watched him on television wearing an expensive suit and claiming he was trying to rescue me from human traffickers who had brainwashed me against my loving family. His performance was convincing to those who didn't know the truth, and social media filled with supporters rallying to his defense. During a supervised phone call with the Foster family, I heard strange clicking sounds on the line that shouldn't have been present on a secure connection. The FBI discovered my calls were being monitored despite their security protocols, which meant someone within law enforcement was feeding information to the network families. They moved me again with only 3 hours' notice to pack my few belongings and say goodbye to Ashley, who hugged me and told me to stay strong. Director Thompson's investigation uncovered financial records showing the network had strategically placed members in key positions throughout government, law enforcement, medical facilities, and the justice system across multiple states. They had been building this system for over a century, with my grandmother's journal corroborating names, dates, and connections going back 60 years. The scope was staggering and explained why escape was so difficult and dangerous for women born into these families. 4 weeks later, Director Thompson drove me to the federal courthouse in an armored vehicle with 2 additional agents providing security. The building resembled a concrete fortress with multiple security checkpoints and guards verifying identification at every entrance. Thompson escorted me through underground passages and up a private elevator while explaining that Michael and other family members would be present in the courtroom gallery to intimidate me. My hands began trembling uncontrollably when we entered the courtroom, and I saw Michael sitting in the 3rd row, wearing his finest suit and staring at me with cold intensity. The prosecutor led me to the witness stand where I had to swear on a Bible to tell the truth, while Michael kept his eyes locked on mine, trying to break my resolve. I described the forced medical examinations where doctors working for the network checked my reproductive capacity and declared me ready for breeding purposes. The grand jury members took extensive notes as I explained the genetic charts covering our home's walls with calculations for optimal breeding matches and detailed schedules for planned pregnancies. Michael began shaking his head vigorously when I testified about the sedatives and restraints he brought that night to force compliance with the marriage. His mouth formed the word liar repeatedly until the judge warned him about his behavior and threatened to remove him from the courtroom. My voice cracked with emotion when I described finding my grandmother's journal and the failed escape attempt that led to that terrifying night. After 4 hours of detailed testimony, Thompson led me back through the underground tunnels to avoid the media gathered outside. She informed me that James had been arrested that morning for attempting to bribe a federal agent with $800,000 for information about my location. The money came from offshore accounts connected to dozens of network families across 15 states, revealing the massive financial resources they commanded. Federal agents were tracking every transaction and freezing accounts, while arrests happened hourly as the network began to unravel. Back at the witness facility, I met 4 other young women who had escaped from similar situations, and we spent the evening sharing our experiences. One woman named Catherine made dark jokes about creating merchandise that said I survived an arranged marriage cult, which made us all laugh for the first time in months. We compared notes about the medical examinations, breeding schedules, and family charts, discovering that all our families used the same network of doctors and followed nearly identical protocols. Catherine's family had tried to force her to marry her uncle when she turned 17, but she had escaped to a homeless shelter and eventually found the legitimate network. Another woman showed us scars where her father had literally branded her with the family crest to mark her as breeding property. We stayed up late eating popcorn and finding gallows humor in experiences that would horrify most people, bonding over our shared trauma. 4 months after my escape, my mother appeared on a nationally syndicated talk show, weeping while displaying my childhood photographs. She wore her most conservative outfit and dabbed at her eyes with the tissues while telling the host how the government had stolen her precious daughter. The host ranted about attacks on traditional American families and religious freedom, while my mother nodded and cried on cue. Within hours, the video went viral with Save Our Daughters trending and thousands of people calling me a victim of government overreach. Counter-protesters surrounded the witness facility the next morning, carrying enlarged copies of my school photos and demanding I be returned to my loving family. Security added extra guards and installed additional cameras, but the crowd grew larger and more aggressive each day. I could no longer leave for supervised outings because protesters would recognize me and begin screaming that I was being brainwashed by the deep state. The walls meant to protect me felt like another prison as I watched freedom through bulletproof glass. Director Thompson visited that afternoon with files showing my family's connection to 8 suspicious deaths over 50 years. Each woman had attempted to leave or refused an arranged marriage before dying in accidents or alleged suicides. I recognized several names from my grandmother's journal, including a cousin who had fallen downstairs the week before her planned escape, breaking her neck in exactly the right way to kill her instantly. The patterns were obvious when examined together, with similar injuries and suspicious timelines that defied coincidence. Thompson said the FBI was exhuming bodies for new examinations, but warned me this would make my family even more desperate and dangerous. That night, I noticed a black van idling outside the facility just beyond the range of the security lights. It sat there for hours with the engine running and tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Security said they couldn't take action unless someone exited the vehicle or made explicit threats. But we all knew who was watching. Sleep became impossible without checking the window every hour to see if the van had moved closer to the building. During an evacuation drill 3 days later, Ashley walked calmly out the emergency exit and got into a black SUV that had been waiting in the designated evacuation area. Security footage showed her looking directly at the camera before entering the vehicle, as if she wanted us to know it was her choice to return. 3 days after that, her family released a video of Ashley sitting in her childhood bedroom, claiming she had been brainwashed by radical feminists. Her eyes appeared glazed and unfocused, suggesting heavy sedation, but she recited her lines about wanting to return to her loving family and their traditions. The prosecutor called an emergency meeting to warn me that Ashley's recantation was severely damaging our case. 4 more witnesses had gone silent after family contact and refused to testify or respond to FBI communications. The defense lawyers were successfully painting this as a government conspiracy to destroy religious families who simply wanted to preserve their traditional way of life. Every news channel ran segments debating whether we were victims or liars attempting to destroy our families' reputations for attention or money. 5 months after my escape, my parents posted my childhood medical records online, including psychiatric evaluations from network-affiliated doctors. The evaluations portrayed me as delusional and prone to fabricating elaborate stories for attention, but conveniently omitted that all the doctors worked exclusively for network families. Stop. Lies began trending within hours as people dissected every word of my testimony, looking for proof I was mentally unstable. Death threats flooded the FBI tip line from strangers saying I deserved whatever my family had planned for me. Some messages were so graphic and detailed that Thompson assigned additional security to my detail. My former teacher, Ms. Chen, testified 2 weeks later, and I watched from behind bulletproof glass as she presented a folder of photographs she had been taking since I was 15. She spread them across the evidence table, showing bruises on my arms from when my mother would grip me during genetic legacy lectures and marks on my neck from Michael practicing his control techniques. The defense attorney immediately attacked, demanding to know how she obtained these photos and why she never reported suspected abuse to Child Protective Services if she was genuinely concerned. Chen's hands trembled as she explained she had attempted to report the abuse 3 times. But my parents always had documentation claiming I was clumsy and injured myself accidentally. The attorney brought up a decade-old DUI from Miss Chen's past and suggested perhaps she had inappropriate reasons for photographing a student. I wanted to stand and defend her, but the prosecutor kept me seated, knowing any outburst would be used against us. After court that day, I met with a trauma specialist who worked with cult survivors, and she explained that my hypervigilance and inability to eat certain foods were classic PTSD responses. She shared her own escape from a religious breeding cult 25 years ago and admitted she still felt panic when someone knocked on her door unexpectedly. We talked for 3 hours as she helped me understand that my symptoms were my mind's way of protecting me from returning to danger. Margaret testified the following morning through an encrypted video link from an undisclosed location for her safety. She described helping 23 young women escape over the past 6 years, and the defense objected constantly, trying to prevent her testimony from being heard. Margaret persisted, providing dates, locations, and names of women who had successfully escaped, including 4 from Michael's immediate family, who are now living under new identities. She presented recordings she had been making for years of network members discussing their breeding programs in explicit detail. The prosecutor played Margaret's recordings in the courtroom, and Michael's voice filled the space, crystal clear as he discussed what would happen when they recaptured me. Once we retrieve her, she'll need intensive reconditioning. The basement facility is fully prepared for resistant cases. Everyone in the courtroom fell silent when they heard my father discussing the disposal of failed breeding stock and describing what happened to women who couldn't produce acceptable offspring for the bloodline. The judge called an immediate recess, and I saw 3 jurors wiping away tears as they left the courtroom. 4 days later, the judge announced he had received credible death threats against himself and his family, requiring federal protection to continue presiding over the trial. 2 jurors requested to be excused, reporting that dead animals had been left on their doorsteps with threatening notes about the consequences of betraying traditional families. The defense filed for a mistrial, claiming the media attention and intimidation tactics had made it impossible to receive a fair trial. I sat frozen as everything I had fought for seemed to crumble, while the judge considered their motion. He ultimately denied it, but warned that any additional incidents would force him to declare a mistrial, which would mean starting the entire process over. 6 months after my escape, I began taking online classes to complete my high school education while living in the safe house. I would sit at the kitchen table working on calculus problems with 2 FBI agents in the living room monitoring security feeds. Writing essays about constitutional rights felt surreal when I considered how my family had twisted the concept of freedom to justify their control over women's bodies. James called the prosecutor's office one morning, claiming he wanted to cooperate with authorities. He arrived with his attorney and spent 7 hours detailing breeding programs operating in 48 states with shared databases of genetic matches and breeding schedules. Some families literally traded daughters like livestock, attempting to achieve optimal genetic combinations according to their twisted science. His testimony transformed the case because it revealed not just my family's crimes, but a nationwide network of hundreds of families engaged in the same practices. My mother was arrested on conspiracy charges the next day after James revealed she had personally overseen 5 correction procedures performed on young women who resisted their assigned marriages. The judge granted her house arrest with ankle monitoring, but the photographs of her leaving court showed someone I barely recognized, with her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her designer clothes wrinkled. The composed matriarch who had controlled every aspect of my life was finally facing consequences. I was studying for a history exam when Margaret called with devastating news about a young woman named Emma from her network who had been found dead in her apartment. The police ruled it a suicide, but Margaret knew Emma was scheduled to testify the following week about her own family's breeding program. We both understood it could have been any of us found in that apartment, and the message was clear about what happened to women who spoke out against the network. Michael violated his restraining order by creating fake social media accounts to send me messages containing photographs of me at the foster home, walking into the courthouse, even sitting in the safe house kitchen doing homework. The FBI launched an intensive investigation to determine how he had obtained these images when I was supposedly under complete protection. They discovered a tracking device embedded in my laptop and realized someone within their own organization was feeding information to the network families. 7 months passed with me relocating between safe houses every few weeks, while the FBI conducted an internal investigation to identify the mole. They finally caught Agent Richardson passing information to his wife, who came from one of the network families in North Carolina, and everything had to be restructured immediately. I was exhausted from constantly running, packing, and never staying anywhere long enough to feel even momentarily secure. But stopping meant they would find me and either drag me back or eliminate me as a threat to their continued operations. The morning they moved me to the 6th safe house, my phone rang with James calling from an unrecognized number. His voice shook as he informed me that our father had been found dead in his cell, hanged with a bedsheet, despite being on 24-hour suicide watch. James said our father had just agreed to testify about the network's leadership structure in exchange for a reduced sentence, and now he was dead less than 12 hours after making the deal. The guards claimed suicide, but the timing was too convenient, and investigators were split between murder and suicide theories. Without our father's testimony, the prosecution's case rested heavily on my testimony and James's cooperation. The defense attorneys brought in expert witnesses who testified about false memory syndrome and mass hysteria, explaining how siblings could create shared delusions to explain family dysfunction. I watched the jury members' expressions shift from sympathy to skepticism as these well-paid experts in expensive suits explained how the human mind could invent elaborate conspiracies to cope with ordinary family conflicts. Director Thompson found me sobbing in the courthouse bathroom after a particularly brutal day of cross-examination, where they had portrayed me as an attention-seeking teenager with mental health issues. She sat on the bathroom floor with me and admitted she had been removed from the case after her own family began receiving threats, but promised to continue helping unofficially, even if it cost her career. Her dedication reminded me that some people would risk everything to fight for justice. My mother took the stand the following week, dressed in black mourning attire with pearls, dabbing at her eyes as she told the jury I had always been a troubled child and they had tried everything to help me. She produced medical records from doctors I had never seen, therapy notes from sessions that never occurred, and prescriptions for medications I had never taken. Her performance was flawless as she portrayed herself as a grieving widow who had lost her husband to suicide and her daughter to mental illness and radical outside influences. The jury deliberated for 4 days while protesters filled the courthouse steps, holding signs calling me either a brave survivor or a pathological liar seeking attention. I couldn't eat anything substantial and barely slept, spending my time reading my grandmother's journal repeatedly, finding strength in the stories of women who had fought this battle before me. On the 3rd day of deliberations, a juror was dismissed after someone left photographs of her children at her home with explicit threats about the consequences of voting against traditional families. The alternate who replaced her had a surname I recognized from the network database. The judge refused to dismiss the new juror without concrete evidence of bias, even though I could see the family resemblance to one of the Alabama breeding families in her facial features. James called from the hospital 3 days later with his jaw wired shut after 4 men attacked him in protective custody, beating him so severely his spleen ruptured and he required emergency surgery. He could barely speak through the wires, but refused to recant his testimony, even though I could hear terror in every word he managed to articulate. I visited him the next morning, holding his hand while machines monitored his vital signs, reminding him why we were fighting and that backing down now meant they had won. Later that day, I sat in a courthouse bathroom stall, listening to 2 women at the sinks discussing our case as if it were entertainment. One insisted I was obviously lying for attention because no real family would do such horrible things, while the other agreed, mentioning her own daughter's tendency to exaggerate when she didn't get her way. They left laughing about dramatic teenagers while I sat there realizing how impossible our truth sounded to people who had never witnessed what families could do behind closed doors to maintain power and control. The verdict came that afternoon with the foreman reading in a trembling voice that they found Michael guilty of attempted kidnapping, but not guilty on conspiracy charges. My mother was found not guilty on all counts, and the broader network charges were dismissed due to insufficient evidence despite boxes of documentation we had provided. The room spun as the judge thanked the jury for their service and announced Michael would be sentenced to 6 years, likely to serve only 3 with good behavior. My mother smiled at me from across the courtroom while her attorney congratulated her, and Michael's lawyer immediately began discussing appeals. Director Thompson intercepted me outside the courthouse and pressed a flash drive into my hand before disappearing into the crowd without explanation. That night, I discovered the drive contained copies of every document the FBI had collected about the network, including internal emails between family members discussing optimal genetic pairings and breeding schedules. Within 4 days, the Washington Post contacted me asking to confirm details from leaked documents they had received, and I knew Thompson had sent copies to multiple news outlets. The story broke on Sunday morning with a front-page exposé about secret breeding networks operating across 15 states. My phone rang continuously as 4 more women who had escaped years ago contacted reporters with their own accounts of forced marriages and reproductive coercion. My mother held a press conference on the courthouse steps 3 days later, wearing her finest suit and pearl necklace while announcing a lawsuit against the government for violating religious freedom and parental rights. She claimed any settlement money would support other traditional families, defending their constitutional rights to arrange marriages within their communities. Behind her stood 4 teenage cousins I recognized from family gatherings, and my heart sank knowing they were next in line for breeding assignments. The 60 Minutes producer called that afternoon, asking if I would do an exclusive interview about my escape and the network. Thompson warned that going public would increase the danger, but hiding hadn't protected me anyway. I agreed to the interview and spent the next week gathering every piece of evidence, including my grandmother's journal and the genetic charts my mother had created. 9 months after my escape, Miss Chen arrived at my apartment with a manila envelope containing my high school transcripts. Despite everything, I had earned enough credits to graduate, and she had convinced the school board to issue my diploma based on completed coursework. I sat on my couch holding that piece of paper and crying because it represented something they never wanted for their breeding stock, education, and independence. The 60 Minutes crew arrived the following week, transforming my living room into a television studio with professional lighting and multiple cameras. I spread the breeding charts across the coffee table and showed them medical records from the network doctor who had examined my reproductive system. The interviewer's expression grew increasingly disturbed as I read passages from my grandmother's journal describing what happened to women who refused their breeding assignments. When she asked if I regretted leaving my family, I answered immediately that I only regretted not leaving sooner and not being able to help others escape. The interview aired to 15 million viewers on a Sunday night, and within minutes my devices exploded with notifications. Some messages praised my courage, while others contained graphic death threats and accusations of betraying my race and heritage. 4 members of Congress announced investigations into breeding networks the next morning, and suddenly, everyone was discussing the dark reality of forced marriages in America. My mother appeared on Fox News calling me mentally ill and claiming liberal professors had brainwashed me into hating my heritage and destroying our family. More survivors began contacting me after seeing the interview, including a woman who had been paired with her uncle at age 4 tunt. I connected them with the legitimate underground network and began building a comprehensive support system for escapees. Margaret called in tears because 5 women had reached out after seeing my story and were planning their own escapes. We spent hours coordinating safe houses and creating new identities for women whose families would never stop hunting them. 3 weeks later, the prison called to inform me that Michael had been killed by another inmate who had stabbed him in the shower. The investigation revealed the killer had no connection to me or my family, but Michael had apparently been trying to recruit white supremacists for the breeding network, which led to the fatal confrontation. I felt nothing but relief knowing one less predator could hurt women like me. The FBI launched simultaneous raids on 14 network families based on tips that flooded in after the interview aired. 17 children were removed from homes where breeding preparations had already begun, including a 13-year-old whose parents had selected her future husband. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, recognizing the same terror in those children's faces that I had felt the night I ran. 4 of the rescued teenagers testified about their families preparing them for breeding duties, and this time, prosecutors had overwhelming evidence. My mother was arrested on new charges of conspiracy to commit child abuse and trafficking of minors for reproductive purposes. The judge denied bail after reviewing testimony about the network's history of eliminating witnesses. I watched my mother in her orange jumpsuit at the arraignment, looking nothing like the perfectly composed matriarch who had controlled every aspect of my life. Other network families began turning against each other for reduced sentences, and the entire system started collapsing. The prosecutor called to tell me 23 more people had been arrested, including the network doctor and several family patriarchs who had arranged marriages. My older brother was arrested for helping transport underage cousins across state lines for breeding meetings. Even relatives who had seemed uninvolved were exposed as active participants in the network's operations. The investigation expanded internationally as survivors came forward with evidence of similar breeding programs in other countries. Within 8 months, the network that had operated for over a century was completely exposed, and most of its leadership faced serious prison sentences. James ended up in witness protection after testifying against the remaining family members in multiple trials. The marshals relocated him somewhere in the Pacific Northwest with a new identity that remains confidential. A month later, I received a letter forwarded through the prosecutor's office where he apologized for his complicity and for choosing comfort over protecting me when he knew what was happening. He wrote about his therapy sessions and trying to understand why he had participated in something so obviously wrong. The letter sat in my desk drawer for weeks before I could read it again without shaking. I hadn't forgiven him, but I kept it as a reminder of how people could change. Congress passed legislation 7 months later, making forced genetic matching and breeding programs federal crimes with mandatory minimum sentences. They called it the Survivor Protection Act, and I stood with 14 other survivors when the president signed it into law. Reporters asked how it felt to change history, and I could only think about all the women who hadn't survived to see this day. College started that fall, and I used my real name for the first time in over a year. My major was social work with a focus on cult recovery, because I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. The nightmares still came most nights, and I jumped whenever someone touched me unexpectedly. But my therapist assured me these were normal responses to severe trauma. My roommate knew my whole story from the news coverage, but treated me like any other student. We studied together, complained about professors, and debated whether the cafeteria pizza was actually food. My mother's trial lasted 10 months, but the jury only needed 3 hours to convict her on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 30 years, and she stood there claiming she was protecting our family's legacy until the bailiffs placed her in handcuffs. She looked at me one final time as they led her away, but I kept my eyes on my phone, scrolling through messages from survivors I was helping. That woman had never been my mother in any way that mattered. Margaret and I established a legitimate organization to help people escape from families like ours. We used everything we had learned operating underground, but now had real lawyers, official safe houses, and protocols that didn't require hiding from authorities. The network my grandmother wrote about in her journal had evolved into something official with non-profit status and government funding. Therapy happened twice a week in an office with soft lighting and comfortable chairs where I learned about complex PTSD and trauma responses. I still checked locks multiple times and sat with my back to walls in restaurants and startled when men approached too quickly. My therapist kept reminding me that healing wasn't linear and some days would be harder than others. She was right because some mornings I couldn't leave my bed, while other days I felt almost normal, able to laugh with friends and imagine a future beyond survival. Then a young cousin I had never met called our emergency hotline one night, whispering that her parents were planning her marriage to a man in his 40s. I activated our response team immediately and walked her through the escape protocol, while Margaret contacted law enforcement in her state. 4 days later, she was safe in foster care, and her parents were under investigation. Every rescue broke the cycle a little more, preventing another generation of women from suffering. My grandmother's grave was in the old family cemetery, but I had never visited until that spring. I brought fresh flowers and the journal that had saved my life and so many others. I sat on the grass and told her about the network collapsing, the new laws, and all the women who were free because she had been brave enough to document the truth. The headstone was simple granite, but I traced her name with my fingers and thanked her for risking everything to leave evidence that would eventually bring justice. The survivor support group met every Thursday evening in a community centre where we sat in a circle sharing our stories. New escapees would arrive with the same haunted expression I once had, and I would tell them it gets better, even when it feels impossible. Not perfect, not easy, but better than they could imagine. I always told them they were free now, and that freedom was worth any price. They usually cried and I held their hands, remembering being 18, terrified, and certain I would never escape. Now I was 21, sitting in my dorm room studying for a social work exam, while my roommate brought me coffee, and we joked about our statistics professor who somehow made probability theory sound like poetry. Outside my window, students walked to class without reading charts or forced marriages or family councils deciding their futures. I had become exactly what my family never wanted: educated, independent, childless by choice, and completely free to determine my own path. The journal sat on my bookshelf between textbooks, a daily reminder of where I came from and why I would keep fighting for every person still trapped in families that saw them as property instead of people. My phone buzzed with another emergency call from a young woman in Texas, and I answered immediately. Because this was my life now, my choice, my purpose, my freedom that nobody could ever take away. And knowing that I could help others find that same freedom made every struggle worth it. Every sleepless night meaningful. Every small victory a step toward breaking these cycles forever.